Hi, and welcome to this week's Renewable Roundup podcast from Schneider Electric. I'm Russell Reading, Head of Energy Markets here at Zeigo. This week, I'm joined by Mark Chappell, who is our European expert. Mark recently attended the Solar and Storage event. He's going to be talking to me about what things he heard around solar and storage, and particularly, he's mentioned some really interesting things to me about how you sell a BESS project as part of a hybrid PPA. I'm excited to hear what he's got to say. If you enjoy this podcast, please feel free to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss a thing. Right, I want to know what he's heard and what he's got to say, so let's get stuck in. Hi Mark, thanks for joining the podcast this week. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thanks, Russ. How are you keeping? You well?
I'm good. I've been enjoying a bit of spring sunshine. You, I believe, were at the Solar and Storage Live event in London.
Yes.
How was it?
It was a good event. Yeah, it's not one I've attended before, so a new experience from my side. But as always, with these things, a mixture of good insights, things that I agree with, things that I don't necessarily agree with. But it's good to hear what the industry's saying. There's always different perspectives. So yeah, looking forward to discussing this topic in particular today.
That'd be good. I went last year. I didn't make it this year, so I'm glad you went.
Yeah.
But I would be interested to hear what sort of topics people were discussing. What people were talking about. What were the hot topics that they were wanting to raise?
Yeah, sure. So, well, I mean, we could go off down a numerous different subject matters here, but perhaps, yeah, if we kind of split it out into solar, PV, BESS, perhaps some policy in there as well. But you know as well as I do, a lot of this interlinks. But
Mm.
yeah, I mean, focusing on solar in the UK to start with, or perhaps even more globally, there was an interesting statistic right at the start of the conference that export panels, the number doubled in China in March, reaching a record 68 gigawatts, which is the largest monthly total ever recorded. Now,
Wow.
I thought that was fascinating. It's equivalent to Spain's entire installed solar capacity shipped in a single month, just to kind of
Wow.
summarize the scale. Yeah, exactly. A large part of this was, I think we discussed this a while ago, Russ, was the export tax rebate was due to end on the 1st of April in China.
Right.
So it was almost like the mad rush before those new rules came in. And to a secondary degree as well, it's no secret, the Iran situation as well is kind of changing the situation globally in terms of moving panels about. But yeah, I mean, there was kind of some debate over, is this the end, of cheap panels? Is this these new controls? Additionally, labor costs are on the rise. Are we in a new era for solar, I guess, is one of those questions longer term. Um,
That's
I don't know if you
that's
have a view on that, Russ.
No, it's really interesting. So basically, and I hadn't sort of considered it. There was kind of like a dash to get panels out and into stock with, should we say, customers who want to use them or distributors wherever to get those panels out to beat the
Hmm.
increased costs. And then there's a question, like you say, does it slightly rebalance things?
Mm.
Because in my head, solar's always been a cheaper option, perhaps easier to deploy.
Yeah.
There's not as much construction necessarily, and you can deploy it more easily, and therefore it's cheaper. But obviously, we're seeing, which I'm sure you'll talk about when we talk about BESS, what we're
Yeah.
seeing is the need for rebalancing the grid and negative
Hmm.
pricing and all this kind of stuff. And I actually wonder if it might help wind projects or even other technologies a bit if actually solar isn't as cheap as it was and it slows the solar deployment down, but only in totality if maybe it shifts it to other technologies. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And I feel like it's just another challenge that developers, IPPs have to deal with. It's incredibly competitive at the moment. I don't think that's uh, up for debate. It's kind of financiers are offering less favorable terms, I imagine, for standalone solar. I mean, we'll get on to the best topic as well. But not just that, I think with the corporate position and re-strategizing the way they look at PPAs, any additional complication or rising costs for developers, it's just another layer of complexity that perhaps they don't need right now. And in that regard as well, you mentioned the build out of solar. I mean, this was another topic discussed. Like PPA structures are becoming more complex. There's a debate at the moment as to how the cannibalization risk is spread between the parties. And I feel like different players, on stage, on panels, were had conflicting opinions on this. Like obviously we have a position, as an advisor and we support clients, in this regard, but it's an open discussion and no one wants to take on that risk. But, with the rise of negative pricing, amongst other factors, this needs to be taken account of. And this was a timely topic, I suppose. Particularly with regards to solar and solar PPAs.
Yeah. I mean, you see, like you said, we've seen, quarter on quarter, year on year, certainly, we've seen those um, increases in negative pricing, and we've seen some big negative numbers in Europe
Mm,
touted around, and it is that, in many ways, we have significant deployment of renewables,
yeah,
globally. It's not a bad thing. You know, to slightly use a pun, we've had the sun's been shining and the winds have been fair. In the US, you had the tax credits. In Europe, you had really high and then volatile energy prices, and it made sense to find a way of getting out of the market, which had been stable for so long, and the PPAs offered that.
mm,
Um, and I think it has pushed deployment, which has been great. But now we're in a position, like you say, where potentially those things are not they're not as they were. If there are so many more challenges to overcome, the market has moved. But one thing I think I do know is that you know every time we've seen some sort of challenge, the commercial community, shall we say, the energy community, the corporates, we, it's work. It gets worked around. It gets solutions
yeah,
are found, and we still keep moving forward. You know what? Sometimes it slows down, but people find a way, and we will find a way, and deployment will continue. There'll be drivers. Maybe we're already seeing it in places in the US. The demand for energy is increasing, and um, time to get power on is not as quick as it could be. So actually, maybe the PPAs begins to come back to making sense there again, and things are changing and shifting in Europe. Once we get through GHG, that will begin to feed out. So I think it'd be interesting
yeah.
because I think. Like you say, with things like BESS, that's coming to the fore now because it's kind of a
Mhm.
way to make sense of it in the current market.
Yeah, exactly, 100%. And happy to move on to best, in a moment. I think just one final point I do want to mention on solar, sorry, before the best is that we've had this discussion before. I mean, this is focused on the UK market. The preferred route to market for projects from the developer side, I think it's particularly pronounced in the UK, more so than perhaps some of our European neighbors.
Hmm.
The CFD and the auction scheme is by far the most attractive proposition. Now, there are we've always, centered this discussion in the past around perhaps the credit benefits associated with contracting under that scheme, and also some of the commercials, particularly recently as well with the longer terms. So the shift from 15 years under CFD to 20 years. Now this is, going by some of the models, the IRR is improving and it's de-risking the whole process, versus the competitive market. And it definitely helps that the government is really kind of supportive of renewables in this space. And it seems to be that the vast, majority of new projects are looking to come to grid via that route to market. But one thing I found interesting, that perhaps a slightly different view I hadn't seen before, is not only due to those reasons, but the CFD is playing a role in queue management as well. So again, we'll come on to, I'm not by no means an expert on connections reform, but some developers were saying that even, going down that route, it gives them gate two status. It means it's easier to connect the projects. Uh, I don't know how you feel, Russ, but I've heard from several developers that their projects have been delayed by the DNO a year or more. I'm curious to see like if that really is the case, like are these projects coming onto the grid sooner, or is it just perhaps conflicting messages? Perhaps it is a bit of a mess. Um,
Yeah, I think
yeah.
I need to be careful because I think we're probably what, like 10 minutes in, and I could easily talk for another half an
Yeah,
hour
yeah.
about this subject, which simultaneously I find very interesting and slightly infuriating. Anyone who follows my LinkedIn posts will know, probably before I even say it, what I think, in terms of the CFD interaction with the PPA market. It distorts the market. It absolutely does. And I think it's a real shame, because I do believe that the corporate PPAs offer some real advantages for corporates and end users like us, the people who buy the goods that those corporates make. Um, I don't deny that the CFD gets things done, particularly big offshore projects which decarbonize a lot
Mhm.
of the grid. That's great. They're going to struggle to find PPAs and things. I get that. Um, but I do think, you know, it's a good way of getting things done. And for developers, it's a route to market. It's great, but I think for us out here, I worry about it and the costs of it, and it certainly just distorts the PPA market, which is a shame and is unfair. But it's interesting what you're saying actually about the grid connection, because if that gives them a bit of a boost in the grid connection, you can see why things begin to add up. Well, it's a competitive process, but there are lots of pros. I don't have to worry about credit.
Mhm.
The terms are known. Yes, I've got to worry about negative pricing, but there are ways that I can find an offtake contract that might mitigate that, as we've seen in the work that we've done. And then, and there might be some grid advantages here as well. That'd be really interesting, wouldn't it? Because you can then see why. So it makes sense why I'm just, I'll go for that route first.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, go on then. So I'm gonna move us on before we disappear down
Sure,
the
sure.
CFD rabbit hole. Sorry, Mark. Um, what were people saying about BESS? I mean, I know BESS is a really hot topic. Everybody's talking about it. Everybody's thinking about doing it or doing it, for lots of reasons. What were people saying? Talking about at the event.
Yeah, yeah. No, you're absolutely right. It's definitely a hot topic. It's at the event, it's all over LinkedIn, Everyone we engage with is asking about this question. And I think it's fair to say, undisputedly, it is a nascent industry. There are a multitude of different opinions on BESS. Um, what it can do, the benefits, the advantages. But yeah, perhaps in terms of a little snippet on this call, we can talk about a couple of things. So one thing I'd say is scaling storage. How there was a lot of suggestions about how we can do this at the event. And the
Yep.
second topic around how to sell the BESS. Um, in the PPA, which I think is a very kind of curious topic. I know we've had several discussions on this in the past, so any preference on where we begin, Russ?
Mm, no, I'm interested in what people think about the second one, so selling it. But I
Yeah.
think that could be quite involved. So let's start with scaling it then, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. So a lot of the discussion, I mean, it is fair to say the UK BESS market is actually one of the most advanced in Europe, and there were several interesting statistics on this. But again, like we are far from perfect, and
Mm,
a lot of the best, developers, operators were outlining a number of challenges that they are facing. So how can we scale storage? What do we need to improve? So first of all, connections reform is not giving them the results as promised. So this is an ongoing conversation. Building a new grid in a new world is very challenging, and this is not UK specific. Like this is a systemic issue,
yeah,
across Europe.
yeah,
Um, Updating the policy, but also there was some. I know this I found curious. So there was a lot of debate around REMA. So for those who don't know, whether the UK would transition to a zonal pricing arrangement or not, but some of those battery operators were saying that there's still a bit of uncertainty around reform to national pricing and what that means for them, which is a good point. So how that kind of builds in, to future revenue projections, there is still no clarity on this, and perhaps we do need to move to the next steps. I don't know when the next update is due, or if you've seen anything, Russ.
yeah. There were some things that were coming out, but I can't sit here and say. I think you're right. There's a lack of clarity. It's
Yeah.
unfortunate, but I think there's a few things that are unclear, changing, delayed. Things like the GHG, the there's the national pricing. There's some other bits and pieces that are floating around. All of it's causing quite a bit of uncertainty about what the impacts might be um, going forward, which is hard to deal with, isn't it, when you're in an investment situation?
Yeah, exactly. Um, and in terms of like tangible effects that some of these issues are having on these developers, like supply chain delays, grid commissioning delays, like this is eating into some of the revenues. Like we've seen this already,
Mm,
in certain European countries, as BESS becomes more mainstream. There was a call for more creativity around new revenue streams, which I found quite interesting. I don't know exactly where they're going with that, but we've seen capacity market in the UK, ancillary services,
yeah,
arbitrage. Like, there's lots of different routes to building value.
yeah,
But there is a worry that perhaps there needs to be more in order to improve the investment case for the battery over the long term. We've seen more tolls, we've seen more floor agreements, and it's just debating whether or not this is going to become the norm because, like I say, this is new to a lot of parties.
yeah.
Um,
It's
yeah.
difficult, isn't it? Because it- as I know from experience, the ancillary service market looked great, and a lot of batteries jumped into it, and then it became oversubscribed, and it crashed the value.
Mhm.
So everyone's looking somewhere else for what can you do? Well, you do arbitrage, or capacity mechanism, and whatever. You look for the things that are going to work at that time. But obviously, like you say, if there's some innovation around other services that they can provide, and there's value in it, then potentially, yeah, I've often
Yeah.
wondered how, because I know that I'm not as close to it as I was, but I know there was work done within the DNO networks. Their
Yeah.
flexibility tenders. It's not just the national networks. Um, for other things, and I think it's bringing it out in the right way, I guess, to see
Yeah.
where
True.
it's easy, make it easier to access, and it's not just saying the value set, because it will potentially be tidal. You want to market, you want it, but you say, look, it's easier to access. I can do this or that or that or that or that or whatever it is.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And yeah, conscious of time. So just one final point on this before we move on to a separate topic on BESS, but there was talk around, in terms of scaling storage, diversifying the technologies available. So we've heard a lot about lithium ion.
Hmm.
Uh, we've there's obviously the possibility of sodium ion or perhaps even longer term duration storage, like compressed air, for example. I mean, this is going to be important, I think, for grid stability, and making sure everything runs efficiently and effectively. But one fact I found very interesting, which I was unaware of. So, I mean, I knew about the maxi auctions in Italy, which were uh, could arguably be used as a blueprint for a lot of Europe because they were very successful. But the average duration was 6.5 hours.
Oh,
So that is kind of well above where I thought the duration would sit. Like I've seen a lot of offers, in PPA processes with the best, 2 hours duration, 4 hours duration, but it seems as though that is becoming longer. And theoretically, they were even talking about 8 to 12 hours charge, which is like a significant uplift, right?
yeah.
And changes the product offering entirely.
It's interesting because I kind of, I suppose, falsely. No, not so falsely, but I sort of remember, batteries. Yeah, that's a 1 hour duration.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
it. That's it. And as you said, we're seeing 2, 3, and 4 hours, or 2 and 4. Much more commonly, and the duration is extending into those into those areas where things like pump storage maybe used to go. And I'm a big fan of pump storage because it was long duration.
Hmm.
So it'd be interesting to see that if batteries can go out there, that changes the whole thing, doesn't it? Because you can say, well, I can either, I'll build a short duration battery and maybe just dump everything in there quickly because that's what you need, or actually, I'm going to build a longer duration battery that provides greater support, a greater period of support over peaks or over the, in the nighttime zone or something like that. It could be really interesting to see how they develop over time, and
Yeah.
and what it does to pricing, because clearly it should raise the daytime pricing and lower the peak pricing, you know, and evening pricing, which could be really interesting.
Hmm. No, I completely agree.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, YK, so let's maybe wrap it up on one last thing. Do you want to talk
Yeah, sure.
either about policy, or do you want to finish up on the other BES element? What's your preference, Mark?
Let's talk about the other best element because this, I think, is a very highly debated topic, and I feel as though there's a lot of value that can come from this conversation in particular. So, yeah, perhaps I can caveat this, Russ, and say, when selling a BESS alongside a solar asset, um, in a PPA, for example, there is no golden bullet, single solution at the moment. Everyone has a different view on this, from corporates to third-party advisors to several other market players. So what I'm going to do is just share an opinion that I heard at the event.
Hmm.
You can agree to disagree because I feel like at the moment, like we have our views on this, right? Like we discuss it with our clients, our developers, but there's no like single point of view. So some of the kind of points that I heard that I felt were just an interesting perspective was that pitching the best on price alone, you invite the customer to race to the bottom, which may not necessarily be in your best interest if you are on the sell side. And perhaps you could be slightly more skewed to being more strategic and leading with the value over the longer term. So almost like thinking like a CFO. So if you think about it, right, like the CFO of a large corporate, maybe they're not just interested in knowing what the lowest price of solar plus BESS is. They kind of want to know the full package, like where is the value,
Mm.
including quality aspects, amongst other things. That might not always be known, right? These things are very hard to model, but it's almost like selling the story rather than just saying, look, I have the lowest price. This is what it is. Um, and another kind of point that was made was that it's important to sell the solar asset first before any discussion on the BESS take place. So almost like I think that this is a different perspective. So we've seen many developers, right, submit co-located projects trying to sell the whole package up front. But in their experience, this provider that I spoke to said, and I think perhaps we've seen this, Russ, right? Like corporates are still relatively agnostic to the BESS. They may not understand it, they may need educating. It's almost like bringing in that conversation later in the process and explaining why this is of benefit to the corporate, how you can do it, because there could be benefits to the developer, of course, like in terms of capital and the overall, return on the assets. So yeah, and finally make the decision simple, conserve complexity, and that is just what we're hearing an awful lot. But
Yeah.
yeah, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm amazed, Mark. You found two topics that like trigger me in one podcast. So
Yeah.
you talked about CFD versus CPPA, and then you talk about leading with the price and leading with value. So this is
Yeah.
something that goes back for me many years. You're absolutely right. Don't be surprised if you commoditize your industry by leading with price.
Hmm.
You're right. What I would say though is I think it kind of depends on what you're doing. I think you need to understand your price, but you do need to understand the whole value piece for
Yeah.
both you and for the corporate or the customer. I think that's really crucial. I think
Hmm.
how you play those cards depends on where you're playing them. I think if you play in a sort of tender process, what you've probably got to do is play your price card early to get you into round two almost.
Yeah, yeah,
So
exactly.
meet the criteria that the customer's looking for, offer a good price, get you into round two, and then you get in front of the customer. You get a bit more time because you're shortlisted. You then begin to show the value to land it. I think if you're directly originating, you can probably play the value card earlier because it gets it shows the really good fit and the value beyond the headline price
Hmm.
early to the customer, and it gets them interested in those wider value pieces and benefits, whether they're tangible or intangible. um so I think that's a really good point. I think both
Yeah.
of those things are really important. I personally just feel like you have to play them in different. You have to play that game tactically differently depending on what it is you're doing.
For sure, yeah. I think you wrapped it up perfectly. Like you were saying, there's some processes where what I've just said may be completely negligible, Like it may be a race to the bottom. It may be that price is key. I think the key kind of take home message here is whether you're working with a corporate directly, whether you're working with an advisor, get to know them, build relationships, know the process, know the value,
Yeah,
and tactically bid on that basis. That would be kind of my,
yeah.
few thoughts on that.
Nailed it. I would agree. I think that the understanding and the closeness definitely pays dividends. And we've seen it. I mean, you're right. We hear from corporates, well, I'm agnostic as whether I need a battery or not, because they're
Yeah.
actually looking at the whole piece. And sometimes you've got to demonstrate the value that the battery can bring to the PPA for them to actually go, oh, okay, yeah, I see it now. I kind of see it as a whole.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I think that's really interesting. What I would say is if you're listening to this and you think it's interesting, reach out to me, reach out to Mark or even Des Connolly. This is something that we look at and we talk about and we talk about with corporates and developers, and we can happily talk to people about it. So, I think that's fair, isn't it, Mark? If people want to know more, because
Yeah.
I think this is a really exciting piece, reach out and talk to us.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, we've barely scratched the surface. I mean, this is just a high level, podcast
Yeah.
overview. if we really want to dive into the detail, that's where we're more than happy to engage in those conversations, because we've done a lot of research on this and we have some interesting perspectives to share. So yeah, please feel free to reach out.
Cool. And on that absolutely shameless plug, I think we'll wrap it up there, Mark.
Has to be done.
Thank you so much for joining me. And obviously thanks for going to Sullivan Storage Live. Appreciated that a lot. And yeah, I appreciate you coming and having a chat. It's been really interesting. So thanks.
Cheers, Russell. Thanks for having me.